Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. These past several days have brought a bevy of headlines about the presidential election and whether or not President Biden will remove himself from the race. Here to give us some context and explain this moment in history is presidential historian David Greenberg. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, glad to be with you. Busy times.
Busy times. As I said to you before we started recording, I feel like I've lived a year in the last week. But let's talk about where we are right now. As we are recording this, top Democrats are calling on President Biden to drop out of the presidential race. What is the precedent for something like this to happen after so many voters have voted in the primaries?
Really, there is none. The primary system as we know it sort of started in 1972. There were primaries before that going all the way back to the early 1900s, but only in the 70s did they become the binding method for choosing the party's nominee. And since then, no one has ever dropped out after winning, which Biden, of course, won. He ran pretty much unopposed. There was kind of token opposition in the form of Dean Phillips, an admirable Minnesota congressman who warned that Biden was not in good enough health or sort of at the top of his game, strong enough to beat Trump in a rematch. But at the time, of course, people stuck with Biden, trusted in Biden, and voted for Biden. So we really are in uncharted territory. You have to go back to the years before the primaries were the method for selecting nominees. And back then, that was done by the delegates, party leaders in each state, governors, state senators, that sort of thing, who would decide our state's going for Kennedy, our state's going for Adlai Stevenson, and they would decide who the nominee was, not the voters at large.
So, are we in a situation now where if President Biden drops out of the race, it's down to these delegates at the DNC?
That's exactly right. So right now, the delegates are bound, they're pledged to vote for Biden, but he can release them from that. He's the only one who can do that. That's why people have been sort of waiting on Biden to say, I'm ready to step aside, which, as we're talking right now, he still hasn't done, although it's looking like that's at least more of a possibility than it seemed, a week or two ago. So we will have a sort of strange and unfamiliar situation where roughly 4,000 people will get to decide who they want the nominee to be. And if there's one person nominated, then it'll be easy. If there's several people nominated, it'll be whoever gets to 50% of the delegates first. You may have to have several ballots before one person clears 50%.
Of course, we're dealing in hypotheticals here, but just to continue down this hypothetical path, if President Biden drops out, he's on a ticket with Vice President Harris. So would he say, or could he confer his delegates to Vice President Harris, or do the delegates literally just get to be on the DNC floor and say, I want Bernie Sanders back, or I want Hillary Clinton back, or what happens there?
Yeah, the delegates get to decide. I mean, Biden can put his thumb on the scales by saying, I endorse Vice President Harris. And if he does that, it would likely be in concert with other party leaders to try to create a fait accompli, the sense that she is the handpicked successor and that most of the delegates would therefore go along. It's also the case that, it changes from convention to convention, but each year the rules specify how a nomination is made, how many signatures or votes you need to be a full-fledged nominee that is, nominated to be the nominee. So you might not have more than one candidate, but if it's a truly open convention, as we call it, then, in the past, sometimes people have from the floor, on the second day of the convention, third day of the convention, we still don't have a nominee. Someone new is put into the mix, and that scrambles everything. I don't think we're likely to go that route this year, but it's not out of the realm of possibility.
So anything is possible, it sounds like.
Well, certainly there's a broad range of possibilities. I mean, right now, what I'm hearing is that there's a sense that Harris should be the nominee if it's not Biden. But there's a lot of other people who look at her polling and say she's not that strong against Trump. Shouldn't the party put forward the person who would be the best, strongest nominee? If we're going this unprecedented route of asking, let's face it, a successful one-term president who's proven himself capable of beating Trump, if we're asking him to step aside after having won all the primaries, we should only take that extraordinary measure in order to get the best candidate out there. And depending on your analysis, that may or may not be Vice President Harris.
Who are these delegates? You mentioned a few potential titles in your comments before, but I guess I'm wondering because if I'm a voter in Pennsylvania or any of the states, I think I'm probably feeling a little bit like, hey, I did my duty as a citizen. I voted in the primary, and now my candidate, again, in this hypothetical scenario, is dropping out. So can I, as a voter, call a delegate and say, I want you to put forward Bernie Sanders because I loved him so much in 2016, or I think Hillary Clinton is the only person who can beat Donald Trump? Can regular voters do that?
Well, they certainly can try. You can certainly weigh in. Whether or not you'll have much influence would remain to be seen. These delegates, when you voted, let's say you're a Pennsylvania voter, when you voted for Joe Biden back in the primary, you weren't actually voting for Joe Biden. I mean, you were, but you were really voting for a list of names of people who had pledged themselves to be Joe Biden delegates. If Dean Phillips, let's say, had actually won in Pennsylvania, a different group of individuals would be going to the convention representing Pennsylvania. They would be people loyal to Dean Phillips. So these people who are loyal to Joe Biden, again, they tend to be prominent state politicians or mid-level politicians, but not always. They might be somebody active in a union, or just sort of people who are locally active in politics and managed to get their name on the ballot as a Biden delegate. And we think that they will probably have leanings much like Biden, sort of center-left, mainstream liberal. But, some of them may track more left-wing progressive than Biden. And in theory, that could be a problem if you have people wanting to nominate a Bernie Sanders or an AOC or a Ro Khanna or somebody who's way out of the mainstream and would likely get demolished by Trump.
Now, there's another phrase or word that we might hear in the coming months, and that's superdelegate. What is the difference between a delegate and superdelegate, and how do they play into this process?
So in the 1980s, the Democrats created the second class of delegates called superdelegates. I think they're now called automatic delegates, but everyone still calls them superdelegates. These are people who simply by virtue of their position, being a sitting governor, elected member of Congress, certain other offices, automatically get a vote. But under new rules, they don't get a vote on that first ballot. So in most of our last 50, 60 years, we've only had one ballot. That's all it took because you had a winner going into the convention. But in an open convention, those first 4,000 delegates might divide themselves among 4 different possibilities. So then on the second round, the superdelegates also get a vote. So their preferences are now in consideration. And the thinking is they would sort of weight the choice, toward a more established, mainstream, proven elected official, less likely than an ordinary delegate to back someone who's either ideologically eccentric or has an unusual background or that kind of thing.
Speaking of unusual backgrounds, you parlayed your answer right into my next question, which is we are speaking during the RNC. It's ongoing as we speak. And Candidate Trump has nominated or chosen J.D. Vance as his vice president this time around, and J.D. Vance spoke at the convention. J.D. Vance, of course, is an author, and he is a senator in Ohio, but it's a relatively young political career. Can you put into context for us J.D. Vance's vice presidential candidacy? How does he compare to other people who are typically chosen for vice president?
Yes, well, I mean, Vance is unusually young. One comparison that's been made is to Richard Nixon, because Nixon, when he was chosen by Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, was also quite young, still in his 30s, had been senator for just 2 years, had been a congressman for 4 years before that, so had a little more experience, but was seen as a new, young, fresh face. This was sort of before he really became known as Tricky Dick in the mind of the public at large. And Eisenhower thought that Nixon could sort of unite the right wing, the wing of like Joe McCarthy and sort of the real like fiercely anti-communist side, with the more moderate wing that Eisenhower represented. And Nixon was kind of seen as able to bridge that. Vance, in his own way, could be seen as a bridge. You know, he started off certainly as a conservative. If people have read Hillbilly Elegy, there's certainly notes of conservative policy prescription, but kind of a moderate conservative, a fairly appealing voice, as the success of his book and the movie that was based on it attest. Went to Yale Law School, where he was surrounded by a lot of liberal people and seemed able to make his way in that world. But in the last few years, he's really turned toward a more Trumpy kind of right-wing conservatism, being very dismissive of the importance of Ukraine and protecting Europe, being more protectionist on issues like trade, and some of these issues where Trump has taken the Republican Party in a more reactionary direction, or populist direction, as some people might call it. So it's hard to know where Vance's, true political leanings lie, or if, as a relatively young man, he's still in the process of figuring them out.
I see. I was going to ask you what his vice presidency candidacy signals about the direction of the GOP. Is it too soon to say?
Well, I think it certainly does indicate, a further move away from, let's call it, Reaganism. Mike Pence 8 years ago was a very different kind of choice. Although Pence was and is a very conservative man, he was sort of tied to that mainstream, what we used to call the conservative movement. He had been a conservative talk radio host, was quite devout in his Christianity and had ties to the Christian right. And Trump sort of picked him to assure that wing, that what was then sort of the mainstream conservative wing, that Trump was not going to veer too far in his own policies from what conservatives wanted. Now, 8 years later, you look at, say, who are the Republicans in Congress? Who are the people that the Republican Party has nominated for governor and senator? It's a very different profile of person, and on many issues, they differ. They still tend to be, a party of tax cutting and anti-government, but that kind of rhetoric is less prominent, and it's much more kind of inward turn, much more an explicit cultivation of the working class vote, the white working class originally, but now increasingly black and Hispanic as well. So Vance, with this sort of, coming from Appalachia, coming from a working class background, Rust Belt, is really sort of playing to that audience and to the hope that this is the future direction of the Republican Party, that he could be someone, that Trump could see as an heir apparent, which, with Mike Pence was never really the case.
You mentioned appealing to working class voters, and I'm thinking about the Teamsters president who spoke at the RNC. And as we talk about history that's been made this week, this is perhaps more of a policy wonk piece of history, but that has never happened. You normally hear union and you think DNC if anyone's going to speak at a convention. Can you put into perspective the significance of the Teamsters appearing at the RNC?
Yeah, well, back in the 70s and even maybe the late 60s a little bit was when you first saw this drift of the working class from Democratic to Republican. And I believe George Meany, I forget if he was the head of the Teamsters or AFL-CIO, endorsed Nixon. So there was some precedent back then. And then in the 90s, Bill Clinton won back labor. Labor was big in Bill Clinton's corner. Anyone who remembers sort of the anti-impeachment rallies, remember these big beefy union guys coming with their pre-made signs. So labor kind of came back to the Democratic fold. But while the leadership of labor did, ordinary working class voters, many of whom were no longer in unions, actually, because unions have been getting progressively weaker for many decades as we no longer have an industrial economy, which is sort of what unions were for. So there's some suggestion that Sean O'Brien might be sort of following his base rather than leading them, that as these voters are just more pro-Trump, they just have more conservative views on all kinds of social issues, immigration, gender, race. It makes sense for their leaders to say, I want you to, I'm going to stick with you and where your political priorities are.
Now, as we talk about the history that's happened within the last week, we'd be remiss not to talk about the assassination attempt on former President Trump. And David, I want to ask you a somewhat broad question. How do assassination attempts affect presidential campaigns and voting outcomes? What do we know about this?
Well, we really can't generalize because, they've been so rare on the campaign trail. Back in 1972, you did have George Wallace being shot. That was a very big deal. But, he was a third-party candidate, and he wasn't really destined to be a major player in the race. Then you go back to 1912 and Theodore Roosevelt. That was a rather amazing story where Roosevelt took the bullet and then continued to read and finish his speech before going off to the hospital. That was also an odd three-way race where Roosevelt, Roosevelt had served as president for 7 years and was trying to come back as the Republican nominee, lost to the incumbent William Howard Taft. So you had a three-way race. Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, ends up winning. I'm not sure that either of those assassination attempts had any discernible effect on the outcome. They're big news stories. And honestly, I'm skeptical that this will have a discernible effect on the outcome. In the moment, it gives Trump a boost, of course. There's a surge of sympathy for him, especially at a time when Biden is contemplating leaving the race, when the Democrats seem to be weak and in disarray. The Republicans are unifying behind Trump. But that happening in July is not likely to make much of a difference come November.
That's interesting because it felt a little bit like in the immediate aftermath, there was this public consensus of this is really going to help candidate Trump. But your perspective is it's July, it's too far away from the actual moment of voting, and perhaps voters are a little too entrenched in what they were going to do already.
Well, yes. And I mean, think about, recent campaigns, 2020, but even more so 2016, all of the major headlines that bombarded us in the fall, from the Access Hollywood tape for Trump to Jim Comey's letter kind of reopening his investigation of Hillary to, Russian hacking. so much went on that something that happened in July was almost forgotten. And I rather expect it's going to be a busy and turbulent fall, especially if, as now seems more likely than not, the Democrats choose a new nominee. Very hard to predict. But if that happens, that will get all the headlines. That person will have to be sort of vetted in real time by the media. There'll be puff pieces, there'll be scandal stories. So we're going to have a lot of news, a lot of twists and turns, I think. And some people say that the real presidential campaign doesn't start till September. That as much as you and I and people listening to us may be plugged in right now, a sizable number of voters really do not tune in until the home stretch. So there's still a lot of minds to be made up.
When you say that it could get even more turbulent, I feel like my only response is buckle in. But I do want to ask you, because you are an historian and you can provide a wide lens on this. So many people say we live in unprecedented times, and I'm sick of living in unprecedented times. How unprecedented is this moment really, and really the past 8 years? Or does history always feel unprecedented when you're living through it?
Well, look, I mean, I never like the word unprecedented because, of course, things are different. I mean, everything's always in flux, everything's always changing. And yes, I mean, I think you'd be a fool to deny that these are unusually polarized times, dramatic times. We've seen a surge in political violence that's quite uncommon, not just the assassination of Trump, but, over many years, other members of Congress being shot at, people being stalked at their homes, like the boundaries of civility are falling away, the guardrails of democracy. But this is not the only time we've been through something like that. I mean, some of our listeners will remember the late 60s as a time where there were multiple assassinations. Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, as I said, Wallace was shot a few years later, not killed, but shot. You had, riots in the streets. It was a very turbulent time when a lot of people thought American society was coming apart at the seams. You can go back, to other eras where there were periods of, anarchist terrorism. You could go back, of course, to the pre-Civil War era. Not that anybody hopes that would be a precedent where the country literally goes to war with itself. So, we are in times that are quite different and quite different from what most of us have grown up with. But at the same time, you can find, certain precedents and certain other periods that were turbulent, that were disruptive, where people feared for the future of democracy, where people feared for the stability of the system. It's cold comfort to say, well, we made it through then. I don't think that should diminish our vigilance and concern about the health of the present moment. But it is important to realize that, this is not sort of completely new in all respects.
So since it is not completely new, and we're coming up towards the end of time I have with you, what are your final thoughts? What would you like to leave with our audience? Either words of comfort, words of this is something to watch for. If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. What is one thing everyone should know as we move forward into this very, very busy summer?
Well, I think, it'd be a kind of foolish to try to offer words of comfort. I tend to be an optimist myself, but I'll confess that I have great anxiety about the state of our democracy and the state of our civil discourse. I do think that times of high political engagement, can lead to times of higher, greater political education, and that if people do sort of use the excitement and the passions that get them into politics, if they then channel that into a kind of serious concern with the health of democracy, we could come out on the other side, if not stronger, at least with our institutions intact. But we have a long way to go before I think any of us can rest easy and say that all is well with American democracy right now.
Well, David Greenberg, we hope you join us on that road again sometime soon. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure. Good to talk with you.